In the shadowy corridors of the Inquisition's tribunal in Lorena, the air was thick with the scent of desperation. It was 1550, and the inquisitors were in a bind. The once lucrative incomes from the prosecution of conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity, but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faith had dried up. The coffers were nearly empty, and the inquisitors were facing a grim reality. No arrests, no money, no way to pay the bills. One inquisitor, Dr. Ramirez, penned a desperate letter to the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, the Suprema, in Madrid. "This Inquisition cannot subsist without going on a visitation every year," he wrote. His words were a cry for help, a plea to find new ways to keep the tribunal afloat. The inquisitors were forced to hunt for suspects, not because they were zealously defending the faith, but because they needed to pay their salaries and keep the lights on. The situation was dire. In 1550, the tribunal owed 1,395 ducats in salaries, but the fines from current cases only brought in 1,000 ducats. The gap was growing, and the pressure was mounting. To make matters worse, the inquisitors had to maintain a facade of power and authority. They couldn't afford to look weak or inefficient, especially when their very existence was tied to the fear they instilled in the hearts of the people. But salvation came in an unexpected form. By 1572, the tribunal had found a new source of income: canonries, or church positions that provided a steady stream of money. 2 canonries in Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo brought in 1,813 ducats, and the confiscation of wealth from the rich family of Lorenzo Angelo in Badajoz raised the income to nearly 5,000 ducats. The tribunal was no longer on the brink of collapse. It had found a way to sustain itself. For the next 2 centuries, the Inquisition relied heavily on these canonries and confiscations. The Tribunal of Granada, for example, received 12.8% of its income from 2 canonries in Malaga and Antequera in 1573. The Tribunal of Cordoba got 40% of its income from 3 canonries in Cordoba, Jaén, and Ubeda in 1578. Without this regular income, the Inquisition would have gone bankrupt. However, the income from confiscations was unpredictable. Most of those accused by the Inquisition were poor, and the inquisitors needed a large number of arrests to generate significant revenue. Windfalls like the great persecution of the Chuetas in Mallorca in the 1680s were rare. The normal state of affairs was a constant struggle to find enough money to cover the costs of administration, prosecution, maintaining prisoners, and the increasingly expensive public executions known as autos de fe. The financial struggles of the Inquisition were not just a local issue, they were systemic. The Tribunal of Granada, for instance, saw its income exceed expenses by 3% in 1618, but by 1705, expenses were 27% higher than income. The Tribunal of Cordoba faced persistent debt over 3 centuries, with expenses exceeding income by 14.6% in 1578, 26.8% in 1642, and 33.8% in 1661. The root of these financial problems lay in the Inquisition's own bureaucracy. In 1498, the first Inquisitor General, Tomás de Torquemada, had suggested that each tribunal have only 2 inquisitors and a small number of officials. By the late 16th century, this modest plan had been abandoned. The Tribunal of Cordoba, for example, had 26 officials in 1578, and the Tribunal of Lorena had 30 in 1598. These officials' salaries consumed a staggering 75.6% of the tribunal's income. Additionally, each tribunal had to send a portion of its income to the Suprema, which had its own expenses. The salaries of the Suprema's bureaucracy were high, with the Inquisitor General alone receiving a quarter of the 15,500 ducats the council spent on wages each year. Furthermore, the Inquisition had to finance special events like the autos de fe, which were not only costly but also essential for maintaining its image of power and authority. In 1655, the Tribunal of Cordoba spent over 5,300 ducats on a single auto, more than half of its annual income. To secure a steady income, the Inquisition turned to censos, a form of investment income. Unlike property, which the Inquisition never accumulated in large quantities, censos provided a reliable cash flow. By the 16th century, most tribunals were heavily invested in censos. In 1611, 63.3% of the income of the Tribunal of Llerena came from censos. In 1792, the Tribunal of Murcia had an income of 103,000 ducats, with only 40% of that going to costs, leaving a significant surplus. The financial story of the Inquisition is one of constant adaptation. From the brink of collapse in the 16th century to the relative stability of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Inquisition found ways to survive. But beneath the surface, the institution was always vulnerable, always struggling to maintain its power and authority in a world that was changing around it. The inquisitors, once driven by the fear of heresy, were now driven by the need for money. And in this endless pursuit, the Inquisition became a shadow of its former self, a relic of a bygone era, but one that still cast a long and ominous shadow over the lives of those it touched. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain was a powerful kingdom with a complex relationship with the Catholic Church. The Spanish Inquisition, established to root out heresy, often clashed with the authority of the Pope and the Church in Rome. This conflict was not just about religious matters, but also about political power and control. During the reign of Philip V, the new Bourbon dynasty took a strong stance against any interference from Rome. The king and his advisors believed that the Spanish Inquisition should have the final say in religious matters, not the Pope. In 1705, the king banned all papal decrees in Spain and prohibited any appeals to Rome. This was a significant step in asserting royal control over the Church, a policy known as regalism. Before the Spanish Inquisition was established, bishops were responsible for dealing with heretics. However, the Inquisition took over this role, claiming exclusive authority over heresy cases. Bishops were supposed to retain some power, but in practice they rarely exercised it. In 1584, the Inquisition even told the Bishop of Tortosa that the popes had given them complete control over heresy cases. This claim was challenged by Pope Clement VIII in 1595, but the conflict was never fully resolved. Religious orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans were often at odds with the Inquisition. The Dominicans, who had a special role in the medieval Inquisition, wanted to maintain their influence. The Franciscans, on the other hand, sought protection from Rome to avoid inquisitorial control. In 1525, Emperor Charles V got the Pope to subject all friars in Spain to the Inquisition, but this was reversed in 1534. The struggle continued until the early 17th century, when the Pope finally sided with the Inquisition. The Jesuits, a new religious order founded by Ignatius of Loyola, also faced suspicion in Spain. Some bishops and theologians, like Melchor Cano, accused the Jesuits of heresy. One of the main issues was that Jesuits were not required to denounce heretics to anyone but their own superiors. In 1585, the Inquisition arrested several Jesuits for concealing heresies, but the case was eventually sent to Rome, where the Inquisition did not win. Bishops were the only group that remained outside the Inquisition's jurisdiction. They could only be tried by the Pope. This was a significant issue in Spain, where many bishops had converso backgrounds, descendants of converts from Judaism or Islam. One of the first bishops targeted by the Inquisition was Juan Arias de Villa, who refused to allow the Inquisition into his diocese. He was summoned to Rome and died there. Another notable case was that of Pedro de Aranda, who was also summoned to Rome and died in disgrace. The most famous clash between the Inquisition and a bishop involved Bartolomé de Carranza, the Archbishop of Toledo. Carranza was a brilliant theologian and a respected figure, but he had powerful enemies. In 1558, he published a book called Commentaries on the Christian Catechism, which was initially approved by the Council of Trent and many theologians. However, his enemies, including the Inquisitor General Fernando de Valdez and the theologian Melchor Cano, denounced the book as heretical. Despite the book's orthodox content, the Inquisition decided to act against Carranza. The situation worsened when two men, Carlos de Siso and Pedro Cazalla, were interrogated and accused Carranza of heretical belief. In 1559, Pope Paul IV gave the Inquisition the authority to arrest bishops for a limited time. On August 22, 1559, Carranza was arrested in Torrelaguna and taken to Valladolid, where he was kept under house arrest for 7 years. During this time, he was not allowed to receive the sacraments, and his case became a pawn in the larger struggle between the Inquisition and the papacy. The Spanish king, Philip II, refused to let the Inquisition hand Carranza over to Rome, seeing it as a threat to Spanish sovereignty. In 1566, Pope Pius V negotiated with the Spanish authorities, and Carranza was finally allowed to go to Rome. He traveled with the Duke of Alba, who was heading to the Netherlands, and arrived in Rome in early 1567. Carranza's case highlighted the deep tensions between the Spanish monarchy, the Inquisition, and the papacy. It was a complex story of political and religious power, where an innocent man's life was caught in the middle of a larger struggle. The aging Archbishop, Carranza, finally arrived in Rome and was placed in honorable confinement within the walls of Sant'Angelo Castle. This was not his first time being detained. This second detention lasted 9 years. Pope Pius V, who was in charge during much of this time, died in 1572 without making a decision in Carranza's case. It wasn't until 1576 that Pius V's successor, Pope Gregory XIII, issued a verdict. The decision was a compromise, likely made to keep Spain happy. The commentaries Carranza's book were condemned and banned, and he was forced to admit to a list of errors. After this, he was told to retire to a monastery in Orvieto. Meanwhile, the Pope took over the management of the wealthy See of Toledo. This verdict didn't fully satisfy everyone. King Philip of Spain and the Inquisition would have preferred a harsher punishment, as an acquittal would have weakened their authority. However, the verdict did satisfy Rome, which asserted its authority over bishops. In a way, it might have even satisfied Carranza, as he was not accused of heresy, even though his book remained banned in all Spanish index editions until 1790. However, the old man, who had been through so much, did not live long after the verdict. He died from a urinary infection just 18 days after the papal decision was read to him on May 2, 1576. The Inquisition, from the start, was closely tied to the crown. This made it more of a secular court than a religious one, according to some historians. Catholic apologists later argued this to distance the Church from the Inquisition's harsh methods. The Suprema, the highest body of the Inquisition, was a government council, not a church council. The king had the power to appoint and dismiss inquisitors, and he often did. Even minor details, like the salaries of doorkeepers in the Inquisition, were decided by the king, as seen in a letter from Ferdinand to Torquemada in 1486. The king was kept well informed about the Inquisition's activities, and any requests for reform were directed to the crown, not the church. Most importantly, the Inquisition was financially dependent on the king. Despite this, the Inquisition was also an ecclesiastical court. The papacy recognized its legal existence, but not its status as a government body. This dual nature caused many conflicts. The Inquisition claimed the right to try its own officials and laypeople for both religious and non-religious offenses. For example, in the 17th century, an inquisitor argued that the Inquisition had ecclesiastical jurisdiction over its lay officers and familiars, meaning secular courts couldn't try them. On the other hand, the Inquisition also demanded the right to try laypeople for non-religious crimes, and to punish those who insulted its officials. The Inquisition also claimed precedence over both church and state in public events. This led to frequent conflicts. Inquisitors argued that they represented both the Pope and the king, so they should be treated with more respect than bishops or viceroys. Church and city officials often refused to attend the Inquisition's public ceremonies, known as autos de fe, because of this. For instance, the judges of the Chancelleria of Valladolid refused to attend a major auto in 1559, and the city council of Barcelona almost never attended these events. The Inquisition's dual nature also caused jurisdictional conflicts. In 1501, King Ferdinand issued a decree stating that the Inquisition had both ecclesiastical and secular authority. Queen Isabella confirmed this in 1503, saying that the two jurisdictions worked together to serve God. This gave the Inquisition the power to arrest royal officials, even when royal courts ruled against them. For example, in the 16th century, inquisitors arrested a corregidor, a royal official in Murcia, for disrespect, the Diputats' local officials in Perpignan for insults, and the Vicar General of Saragossa for arresting a commissario inquisitorial official. They even made the entire city council of Tarragona attend Mass as penitents with candles, to apologize for not letting the inquisitors into the city during a plague. The Inquisition's conflicts with secular authorities were most intense in the Crown of Aragon. The Inquisition often ignored regional laws or fueros, claiming that it was not bound by them if they conflicted with church law. This made the Inquisition seem like an alien institution to many in Aragon. In 1564, the courts of Monzon, a regional assembly, complained that the Inquisition arrested people for minor offenses and issued edicts without proper authority. By 1591, during the Antonio Perez troubles, rebels demanded that inquisitors in Aragon should not be Castilians. In Catalonia, the Inquisition was particularly unpopular. About 1 in 4 Spaniards in the 16th century did not speak Spanish, and in Catalonia, many spoke Catalan. This led to problems during interrogations, as translators were often needed. In the 1560s, the Inquisition decided that all depositions and trials should be conducted in Spanish, even if the accused spoke Catalan. This often led to misunderstandings and injustices. In 1600, the Diputats of Catalonia complained that inquisitors, who were mostly Castilians, were causing many cases of injustice. Conflicts in Valencia and Aragon focused on the treatment of familiars, Inquisition officials, and Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity. The nobility in these regions often contested the Inquisition's jurisdiction. In 1564, the courts of Monzon complained that the Inquisition arrested people for trivial reasons, and in 1566, the Diputados of Aragon demanded that inquisitors should not issue edicts without the bishop's approval. By 1591, during the Antonio Perez troubles, rebels demanded that inquisitors in Aragon should not be Castilians. Catalonia was especially hostile to the Inquisition. In 1566, the Diputats of Perpignan arrested and imprisoned Inquisition officials after a dispute, and in 1568, the Catalans refused to accept an agreement about familiars. The Viceroy reported in 1569 that the Catalans were determined to resist the Inquisition. In 1640, during a revolt against Castile, the Catalans drove out the Castilian Inquisition and re-established the medieval Papal Inquisition. Although the Castilian Inquisition returned in 1653, the Catalans' opposition continued. In Castile, conflicts between the Inquisition and other courts were also serious. The Council of Castile often urged the king to take action against the Inquisition, especially during times of crisis. For example, in 1639, the inquisitors were accused of causing harm by interfering in people's lives and reputations. Government ministers repeatedly criticized the Inquisition, arguing that it should not meddle in matters that did not concern it. During the 1591 troubles in Saragossa, the king's advisors and commander both insisted that the Inquisition should not interfere in non-religious matters. The Inquisition's conflicts with other courts reached a peak at the end of the 17th century. In 1682, the Chancelleria of Granada, a high court, combined with the city council and the archbishop to protest against the Inquisition. The king ordered the banishment of the inquisitors until further notice. In 1696, the Deputation of Catalonia complained about the Inquisition's foreign inquisitors, who did not understand the local people. The Inquisitor of Barcelona, Bartolomé de Carranza, was deported by royal order. This led to the formation of a special committee in Madrid, which issued a report in 1696 detailing the Inquisition's abuses of power. The report criticized the Inquisition for treating all vassals as subordinates, punishing minor offenses as crimes against religion, and claiming immunity from arrests and taxes. The Inquisition's arrogance and overreach had finally caught up with it. In the days of Old Spain, the Inquisition was a powerful force, but its reach and influence were more complex than many believed. While it could be a tool for the crown, it often had a life of its own, guided by its own religious and political motives. King Philip V, for example, wanted to have more control over the Inquisition. He believed that the Inquisition should be under his command, just like other parts of the government, but this wasn't always the case. The Inquisition often acted on its own, sometimes even against the king's wishes. One famous king, Ferdinand the Catholic, used the Inquisition to achieve his political goals. For instance, he once asked the Inquisition to charge Cesare Borgia, a powerful enemy, with blasphemy and atheism. Borgia escaped, but the incident shows how the Inquisition could be used for political reasons. The Inquisition was not always a puppet of the crown. It had its own agenda, especially when it came to religious matters. For example, when Geronimo de Villanueva, a powerful figure under Philip IV's chief minister Olivares, fell from grace, the Inquisition charged him with religious crimes. These charges were based on real religious issues, not just political ones. Some people thought that King Philip II used the Inquisition to strengthen his rule. Venetian ambassadors and papal nuncios, representatives of the Pope, often said this. They claimed that Philip II used the Inquisition to control people and spread his power. However, historians today say this isn't true. The Inquisition was involved in politics, but it didn't always do what the king wanted. It had its own priorities, and sometimes even clashed with the crown. The Inquisition played a role in national crises, but it was usually a small one. For example, during the Catalan Revolution in 1640, the Inquisitor General suggested the Inquisition should take action against the rebels. During the War of the Spanish Succession, the Inquisition threatened to punish anyone who said Philip V wasn't the rightful king. But these actions were rare, and didn't mean the Inquisition was a tool for the crown's political agenda. The Inquisition often had conflicts with other authorities, both religious and secular. In towns, the local elites were the main opponents of the inquisitors. In the countryside, the local nobles were the biggest problem. The Inquisition sometimes tried to disarm the Moriscos' Muslim converts to Christianity, because they were violent against inquisitors. The nobles, however, protected the Moriscos, leading to major conflicts. One of the most famous cases where the crown used the Inquisition for political purposes was the trial of Antonio Perez. Perez was a powerful Secretary of State to Philip II. He had the king's ear and was very influential, but his ambition led to his downfall. He was accused of murdering Juan de Escobedo, a rival. Perez was arrested and put on trial, but the charges were dropped. The king then accused him of murder again. Perez was eventually put to the torture and confessed to the crime. However, he managed to escape to Aragon, where he was protected by the local laws. Philip II wanted to get Perez back, so he turned to the Inquisition. The Inquisition needed a reason to take action, so they accused Perez of heresy. This was based on some innocent expletives Perez had used, like betting his word against God's nose. The Inquisition tried to move Perez to their prison, but the people of Aragon rioted and freed him. The riots turned violent, and the Viceroy of Aragon was killed. Philip II then sent an army to Aragon to restore order. The Justiciar of Aragon was arrested and executed, and many others were punished. The Inquisition held a huge auto de fe, a ceremony where accused heretics were punished in Saragossa. Antonio Perez was among those accused, but he was charged with a different crime, homosexuality. Many others were accused of taking part in the riots. The Inquisition's role in this case showed that it could be used for political purposes, but it also had its own religious goals. The Inquisition was a complex institution, sometimes working with the crown and sometimes against it. Antonio Perez's story is a tale of intrigue and betrayal. After fleeing his homeland, he found himself in the Protestant state of Béarn, in the city of Pau. From there, he launched a campaign against the king, Philip II, publishing a book called Relations that detailed his side of the story. Despite his efforts, the Inquisition still charged him with serious crimes like rebellion and heresy. Perez's efforts in Pau were not enough, and he decided to seek help from Queen Elizabeth I in England. He arrived there in 1593, becoming part of the circle around the Earl of Essex and befriending the famous philosopher Francis Bacon. Perez proposed policies against Spain to the Queen, but his time in England was marred by rumors of his inappropriate behavior with young men. This, combined with the fall of Essex, made Perez's position in the English court very shaky. Perez eventually moved to France, where he had been given a position in the King's Council. However, he couldn't get the support he needed, and lived the last years of his life in relative obscurity in Paris. He died in 1611, complaining about the cold and his loneliness. The story of Antonio Perez is just one example of the Inquisition's reach. Another notable case is that of Pablo de Olavide, a wealthy and educated man who became a leading government minister in Spain. Olavide was a supporter of the Enlightenment and often criticized the church. This criticism, along with his collection of banned books, led to his arrest by the Inquisition in 1776. After a trial, he was banished and had his property confiscated. Olavide spent the rest of his life in exile, eventually returning to Spain in 1798, where he died quietly in 1803. These cases show that even though the Inquisition's power was not as strong as it once was, it still had the ability to ruin lives and silence critics. However, for most people in Spain, especially in rural areas, the Inquisition was a distant and rarely seen institution. Many Spaniards, even those who were not of Jewish or Muslim descent, disliked the Inquisition and saw it as a corrupt and oppressive force. The Inquisition's methods of gathering information, often through informers, have contributed to its negative reputation. The quality of the information received was often questionable, and this led to many injustices. Even in its later years, the Inquisition continued to face challenges, such as widespread illiteracy and the difficulty of gathering reliable evidence. In the end, the Inquisition's impact on the daily lives of Spaniards was limited. People accepted it not because it was a powerful and oppressive force, but because it was often invisible and irrelevant to their everyday life. The Inquisition's legacy is a complex one, filled with stories of both persecution and resistance.